It can get very technical, as my students who've been here long enough can attest to. And Chloe's going, yeah, unfortunately. Um, but it gets easier, right? It gets easier the more you look at it, and it's part of the deal, right? When we want to be X-ray techs, we just have to be, proficient in understanding radiation. Okay, that's the goal. All right, so but enough of that. We're gonna talk about. So I think what I think is the fun stuff. Um, the biologic effects. Okay, what can radiation do to the body? Okay, to living things. So biology is the study of life. Biologic effects are the effects pertaining to life forms. Okay. Cellular effects of radiation, because it happens so radiation damages things at the level of molecules, but molecules build cells, cells build tissues, tissues build organs, and organs build bodies, right? So damage at the molecular level can manifest at the system-wide level. Okay, you guys mentioned cancer, right? That's a system-wide thing that started from some molecular change in the DNA. Okay, so things that can happen. Cell death can happen. Cell death can happen in a number of different ways. High levels, like really acute levels of radiation exposure, can rupture the cell's membrane. Okay, so cells, you may know that cells have a membrane, okay, a phospholipid bilayer, okay, that separates the inside and outside of the cell, right? What's the role of the cell membrane aside from separating the inside and the outside of the cell, but why? To protect it? How do you mean? You're right, but what are you thinking?
Like shield it from harm?
Sure, right? What does your skin do for you?
Protect our organs?
Right. So you want to keep the inside in and the outside out, right? Good. Some things you'd like to let out of your body, right? And some things you may like to let into your body, okay? Cells are a lot like that, right? Cells need to keep in the important stuff, keep out the dangerous stuff, and have some way of mediating that. They are called selectively permeable membranes, right? You are water, your cells are watery, right? We call the cell water cytoplasm. You'd like it if your cytoplasm would, mostly hang out inside of your cells, right? And rupturing the cell membrane can stop that from happening, can cause, the inside to leak out to the outside comes in. That's one thing that can happen. Cell death can happen because the damage to the DNA was so severe that instead of the cell being able to replicate and divide and make two healthy daughter cells, that it fails to replicate everything successfully, and the daughter cells fail to survive. The cell dies at the attempt at division. Okay, it can damage the DNA so severely that, and it depends on what stage in the cell's life, but that the cell can no longer synthesize proteins necessary for the cell's survival. All right. If you didn't already know, DNA's job is to do roughly two things. To replicate so that the cell can divide, but during the cell's lifetime, it's to give instructions to build proteins for the cell so the cell can survive. Okay, you can damage the cell in a number of ways: DNA damage, membrane damage. You can damage the other organelles in the cell potentially. Okay, but cell death at the most severe instances. You'd almost rather have cell death than having a cell malfunction or a cell abnormality, right? Because a cell malfunction or abnormality might propagate into the future. That abnormality or malfunction may not be life-threatening to the cell, and now may allow the cell to make incorrect copies of itself in the future. Now, we learned in one of the previous lectures that 90% of cell damage, somatic damage, is repairable, but 90% is not 100%, right? So 10% of cell damage is not repairable, and that is a cumulative damage. That builds up over time, okay? So cells can malfunction. They can have incorrect processes going on because of DNA damage. Or we can have things like structural deformities, again, typically because of DNA damage. The cell may not do what it otherwise should be doing. Okay, that's important. So roughly three things can happen: cell death, cell malfunction, cell abnormalities. All cells are not created equally, okay? certain cells are extremely resistant to damage from radiation, and certain cells are extremely sensitive to damage from radiation. So this is called the concept of cell sensitivity. Okay, and in 19 something. Who remembers the date? When did Bergoni and Trabando do their experiment? You should be able to pull this up from memory. Early 1900s.
1905.
You're very close. 1906, I think. You can I believe it's 1906, but we can duke it out if you want. Double check me. But anyways, I'd love to be wrong on that, by the way. It's fun when I'm wrong. Okay, so Bergoni and Trabando were two scientists, early 1900s, right? And they did an experiment. You guys remember what they did?
They tested on rodents.
Yeah, rat testes, right? They irradiated rat testes, okay? The testicles on male rats, okay? And it's not very nice, right? But what they learned from that, so why did they irradiate the testes on male rats? Well, because testes produce sperm, okay? 1906, yes. All right. I would have preferred to be wrong though. I really like when my students can catch me on something. All right, keep on it though. If you guys keep on it. All right, cool. You were very very close though. That's props for that. All right, good. So rat testes, right? Rat testes and all testes produce sperm. Sperm have to be matured. Okay, so in any one testy, you're gonna have mature sperm. You're going to have medium level mature sperm, and then you're going to have immature sperm. Okay, we don't need to go into worry about the technical names, but we're going to have sperm at different levels of maturity, right? You're going to have effectively like stem cell sperm, okay, undifferentiated, non-specialized sperm cells, and you're going to have ready to go sperm cells with their head, their little midpiece, and their little wiggly flagellum tail. Okay. So you can irradiate all of that at the same time, and then you can look at, under a microscope, the damage that happens and when and at what levels of radiation the damage occurs. So what they found out is that the degree of sensitivity to radiation depended on how old the cell was. Older cells expressed an increased resistance to radiation damage, so more mature cells, okay? Cells that were more differentiated. So differentiation means specialization, and it's sort of like, a kindergartner versus, a college graduate engineer, right? The college graduate engineer, they know what they want to be when they grow up. They just did it, right? They specialize. They specialize into engineering, okay? But the kindergartner, they don't know what they want to be when they grow up. They are not specialized. They are not differentiated, okay? So in this idea, Bergoni and Trabando said the differentiation matters. The complexity of the cell matters. The more complex, the more differentiated, the more specialized a cell is, the less sensitive it is, the more resistant it is to damage. Okay, so when they did this to the rat testes, the mature sperm were damaged less than the immature, undifferentiated sperm cells. Differentiation matters. The rate that the cell uses energy matters, okay? Cells that had a high metabolic rate, very active, were damaged easier, had a higher sensitivity. So cells with low metabolic activity, they're damaged less, okay? And then lastly, and importantly, the rate of mitosis, right? Mitosis is cell division. Cells split and make two new daughter cells, right? The original parent cell's gone, two daughter cells exist now. That's mitosis. The rate at which a cell mitoses is representative of how sensitive it is. Higher rates of mitosis equal higher sensitivity, okay? So a good example of this in the body, and in fact, I'm not going to say that because on the next couple slides I actually have that, but this is Bergoni and Trabando, 1906, and they did it on rat testes, and they basically say these things that cells that are specialized or have a low rate of mitosis are resistant. Cells that are not specialized or have a high rate of mitosis are very sensitive, okay? So there's a spectrum, right? And we're going to look at some of these cells in just a moment here. And
That makes sense because when we order, now, I always wonder when we would send for like CTs,
yeah,
how insurances would authorize them right away if the patient was like exposed to radiation after 55 years of age. They ask no questions.
Yeah.
I can go through.
Yeah.
But opposed to somebody that's 30 years old and
Yeah.
why? Where were
yeah,
they? What they do?
exactly, exactly.
Where's their employment? Now it makes sense. Now,
So you think every X-ray exam, right, has a reward or a benefit, right? The
Yeah.
benefit of the exam is learning some information, right?
Yeah.
But there's always a risk, right? So
Right.
doctors and the insurance companies are always trying to weigh risk versus benefit, right?
Yeah.
And insurance companies they're not gonna take high risk with low benefit, right?
Right.
So they're and physicians too, and looking out for the patient. So it's a risk benefit thing. And when the risk is very high, then
Yeah.
relatively the benefit is lower, right?
Yeah, like
So
when you smoke cigarettes, they don't ask no questions. You can
Yeah.
get lung screens twice a year.
yeah, yep. There you go. So so this is Bergoni and Trabando talking about cell sensitivity, and you guys remember those of you who were here last class may remember there was another group of scientists, another couple scientists who did experiments about 19 years later, 1925, right? You guys remember their names? Sort of sounded like Hansel and Gretel, but it was Ansel and Weidenberger, right? So Ansel and Weidenberger, right? Ansel and Weidenberger did subsequent experiments and came up with roughly the same answer, but they came to the same answer from a different perspective, right? They said that this is a slight difference from. So to be clear, we pretty much follow what Bergoni and Trabando say, but these guys in 1925 did subsequent experiments, and their experiments ended up saying that all cells share the same degree of sensitivity, no matter their differentiation. So they actually differed from Bergoni and Trabando there. They said all cells share the same level of sensitivity. It's just that you don't see the damage until the cell attempts division. Okay? Cells that never divide, like a nerve cell, never shows damage because it never divides. So they said a different thing, but they sort of came to the same answer. Cells with a high rate of mitosis are more easily damaged, but again, they said it in a different way. So there have been studies. Most of the studies that we rely on were studies done literally over 100 years ago. Okay, but we still take them as valid, and science loves to falsify things. So if this was falsifiable, if this was wrong, we would have done it already, right? So the idea is that it has not been falsified yet. Anytime something has not yet to be falsified, we take it as being true. So that's what science does, right? Science says something's true, and then all of the peers around that in that same field go, we're going to try to disprove that. We're going to try to falsify that, okay? And so they haven't falsified it, which is good because it's probably true. Okay. So tissues with increased sensitivity in the body are things like our blood cells, our skin, our mucous membranes, mouth, nose, stomach, and bowel. And you're going, well, what makes all of these sensitive, right? Remember, what makes things sensitive? Low differentiation and or high rate of mitosis, okay? So you have things that are, non-specialized cells, or you have things that are have a very active, are highly active. Such as any glandular cells, any cells that produce things, like the cells that produce mucus, the cells that, that produce, the ductal cells in the breast that produce breast milk, right? The breast is right here, right? Thyroid cells, very active. So embryos, fetuses, infants, children, adolescents, they have to go from being not very much to being quite a lot. Talk about gestation, right? That 9-10 months gestation. They got to go from being 2 cells to being a full organism in that time, right? That's a lot of activity, right? That's a lot of mitosis. That's a lot of cell division to take place. And that's a lot of specialization too, going from undifferentiated, just 2 cells that don't look like anything, to a whole human, right? And so infants, let me backtrack. Embryos, fetuses, infants, children are all more radiosensitive than adults are. And you can see that because when you go to when we're in the X-ray rooms, or we're in the physicians' offices, you're going to see physicians being much more resistant to irradiate children okay, than they would be to irradiate, as you said, people over 55, right, or the elderly patients, older patients. Good. Okay, let's go forward. We can classify the radiation effects, and you guys saw these earlier, into these roughly 4 categories: short-term versus long-term, somatic versus genetic. So let's talk about each of these. Short-term effects are observed within 3 months, so 3 months or less. In medicine, the definition of acute illness versus chronic illness is an acute illness is any illness that's lasted for less than 3 months. A chronic illness is any illness that's lasted for longer than 3 months. Okay. There are some other things associated with the word acute too, but that's sort of the cutoff point, 3 months. So long-term effects happen after 3 months. Short-term effects happen within 3 months. They're associated. Yes, please.
What are like examples of short-term?
Ooh, good. So if the exposure is between 1/2 and 1 gray to the entire body, we can cause nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. Okay, that's a really good example. If the exposure levels get upwards of 1 gray, we can cause blood cell suppression. We can cause the destruction of the lining of the gastrointestinal system. So the person could die from infection because of loss of leukocytes. They could die from dehydration or starvation because of the damage to the gastrointestinal lining. So those are just some examples. And we do radiation safety 1 and 2. The previous modules to this talk a lot about the like those individual examples. But that sort of gives you a flavor for some of the bad things that can happen. Those are short-term effects, though. These are typically associated with a lot of radiation. They're saying they're associated with radiation doses upwards of 2 sieverts. So 2,000 millisieverts is 2 sieverts. Okay, that's a lot of radiation. It's given to the whole body that can pretty easily cause death. Okay, but I wouldn't. So you can take the number, but what I would take away from this is short-term effects are associated with high dose exposures, acute exposures to radiation. Not the kind that you could receive in a traditional X-ray room, but potentially the amount of radiation you could receive with several CT scans, okay, or a really long time in the cardiac catheterization lab, okay, quite a long time under fluoroscopy, right? You may receive, and importantly, you likely won't receive the radiation dose to the entire body. Okay, so whole body radiation versus partial body radiation changes things. Okay, we can't talk right now about exactly how it changes things, but 1 gray to the entire body versus 1 gray to your pinky finger are going to be different things. They're going to affect the body in different ways. Whole body radiation is more harmful than partial body radiation. That's the takeaway from that I would think of. Short-term effects are associated with being predictable. You asked me what can happen, right? And I said, here's some things that can happen, right? This is called, these effects are called predictable or deterministic, in that we can pretty safely say, based on empirical data, based on prior data, right? If you get this much, then this thing happens to you, okay? That's referred to as deterministic. Okay, so short-term effects are deterministic. We know what happens because it happens right after the exposure. Okay, there's an easy cause and effect associated with short-term effects. The severity of the effect has a proportionality to the dose. That's simply to say that if I give you an amount of radiation, there's a response. If I give you more radiation, there's an increased response. That's all, okay? It's proportional. Now, it might not be directly proportional, right? Twice the amount of radiation might not equal twice the severity. It might equal 4 times the severity or more, right? But the effect is proportional to the dose, okay? Dose goes up, effect gets worse. There are 3 categories to short-term effects. These are called hematologic, gastrointestinal, and central nervous system effects. These go in increasing order from low exposure to high exposure. That is to say, if I gave you enough radiation to cause central nervous system damage, then you also had gastrointestinal damage, and you also had hematologic damage. Hematologic is just blood cell damage.
So, like chemotherapy.
Uh,
Or I'm just,
so yeah, but what are you thinking? Chemotherapy, as
well,
in?
I'm just, well, like, in what I know, chemotherapy, you get that treatment, and then, you know, so the side effects, the short-term side effects is nausea.
Yeah.
One of the immediate things. And then, but the goal is to kill the cancer cells.
Absolutely, right?
So,
Yeah, you're absolutely on it. So let's say so chemotherapy uses chemicals, right? Toxic chemicals, right? And these chemicals are toxic to so who knows somebody who's undergone chemo? I do, right? Did they look great during chemo? No, right? It takes a toll on their entire body, right? If I gave you so much chemical therapy that it would destroy the cancer very quickly, right? It might also kill you, right? If I give you less, it destroys the cancer and hurts you a lot, but you survive, right? This is the idea of protracting or fractionation, right? If there's an amount of, and we can talk about radiation, but if there's an amount of chemotherapy that would cure your cancer, but may also kill you right now, right? Let's not give you that all at once, okay? Let's give you more over the long term, but chunk it up into pieces so that you are damaged and the cancer's damaged. But the trick is, your normal healthy cells should recover faster than the cancerous cells, okay? And when you do that, you can get the person to recover, cancerous cells recover too, but not as much. And if you repeat, eventually the cancerous cells get so suppressed that they just don't recover. So when you're talking about chemotherapy and damage, it's the same idea, right? They're toxic. These chemicals are toxic to the body. They destroy cells. And you can get some of the same type of effects, right? Radiation does the same sort of thing. So radiation therapy is an example of, targeted radiation therapy is an example of when you could give someone enough radiation to potentially cause these effects to occur. Okay, and so to use units that you guys are starting to get used to, none of these things can happen below 1 gray of X-ray exposure. Above 1 gray to the whole body, then these things begin to happen. Central nervous system syndrome requires something like 50 gray-ish or more to make to damage that much. Now, what's interesting about central nervous system syndrome is that you can't actually damage nerve cells. You guys know why?
Highly specialized cells.
That's part of it, but it's not the whole. Think about what Ansel and Weidenberger say. They say specialization doesn't matter, right? So why can't you hurt nerve cells? What don't
they don't replicate.
they don't replicate, right? They have no mitosis. They are amitotic, right? This is why you can't regenerate spinal cords and regrow brains after brain damage, right? I think science is working very, very hard to try to make that happen, but right now there's nothing set in stone that says it can happen, and under normal circumstances, it doesn't really happen, okay? So you can't hurt the nerve cells, but what you can hurt is everything around the nerve cells, right? Your brain is not only neurons, but it's a bunch of supportive cells called glial cells. There are blood vessels in your brain. So primarily what happens with central nervous system syndrome is that the blood vessels around the neurons rupture, and it causes pressure on the brain, sort of like you would have with like a brain bleed. Okay, and then they die from intracranial hemorrhaging and increased intracranial pressure. So these are,
But can the nerve cells die?
they can die. So nerve cells can die, but they die from lack of oxygen, or it's lack of oxygen. So pressure causes issues with blood flow. The lack of oxygen kills the nerve cell. Yeah, so that's why you can like suffocate and have brain death, right? So nerve cells. So yes. So let me be clear because I don't think I was very clear. Nerve cells can't be hurt by the radiation. Okay, nerve cells can be hurt though. Okay, and importantly, they can't regrow and regenerate. Good. Thank you for clarifying. That was important. Okay, The next thing to talk about with short-term effects is what's called the LD, or lethal dose, okay? There's a unit called the LD 5030. This is what it's right here, LD 5030, okay? Now, you're gonna see slightly different numbers depending on who wrote the textbook, okay? So you'll see numbers from about 3.5 to 4 gray, or you'll see numbers of about 5 gray, but right in that range, right in that amount of radiation, is what's called the LD 5030, okay? The LD 5030 says that if a population were given this much radiation to each individual, 50% of them would not survive within 30 days. LD 5030. Lethal dose, 50% of the population within 30 days. And the LD 5030 for animals is different. Primates share roughly the same LD 5030 as us, but insects and rodents have a higher resistance to radiation, and so their LD 5030 is much higher. Increased specialization. Yeah. Yes.
Can you explain what the -T means?
It's not, so the minus is not a minus, it's just indicating that there's a subscript. I know it's really, really confusing because there shouldn't be a minus sign there. The subscript of T means tissue. Yeah, so it's milligray to the tissue. Yeah. That when you see that subscript of T, you know they're talking about absorbed dose, how much actually got into the body, not what you were exposed to. Okay. Oh, by the way, I don't think I was very clear earlier. Roughly speaking, we have to extract. We can't measure dose, right? We can measure exposure. The relationship between dose and exposure is you absorb about 96% of what you're exposed to. So take what you're exposed to, multiply it by 0.96, and that'll be your absorbed dose. But yeah, so the subscript T, not a minus sign, terrible. It's just an error. But anyways, subscript T means tissue.
And then Alex, you
Yeah.
said that the 3.5
Yeah.
grays, that's how much it would take to kill 50% of the population in 30 days?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's like take this room, lock you all in, right? Irradiate everyone in this room, whole body exposure with that much. Half of us die within 30 days. It's a way of expressing it statistically. The 3.5 to 4 gray comes from your radiography textbook. This 5 gray or 5,000 milligray comes from a different textbook. That's all. So different authors. Okay. That's the lethal dose levels. Erase this. Stupid line. Okay. The rest of these are showing some of the other dose levels that get you some pretty severe damage. So at 250 millisieverts, you can begin to have blood changes. That's 1/4 of a gray, or 1/4 of a sievert if you're talking about X-rays. So this will get you suppression of blood cells. Red cells, white cells, platelets, all get suppressed. So you become anemic because of loss of red cells. You bleed easier because of loss of platelets, and you get infection easier. You have less of an ability to fight infection because of loss of leukocytes. Right around 2 sieverts, 2,000 millisieverts, is erythema. You guys all know about erythema because everyone here's probably been sunburned once in their life. And erythema of the skin is a sunburn. So this is sunburn from radiation. In fact, the sunburn you get when you're out in the sun is also because of radiation, right? It's because of ultraviolet radiation. Above 6 gray, excuse me, I'll use the correct unit, 6 sievert or 6,000 millisievert, right? That's what's called the LD100, the lethal dose for 100% of people. It's 6 sievert without medical treatment, and about 7 sievert with medical treatment. So you give somebody 6 sievert to the whole body, which is again really hard to do, and you say you're on your own, right? They're gonna definitely not survive, right? But you give somebody 6 sievert and you give them all the medical support that can help keep them hydrated while their body sort of regenerates, right? So the primary cause of death here is going to be death from infection, right? And death from dehydration and starvation because the GI lining can't absorb anything any longer, okay? If you can give them support so that they can stay hydrated and stay nutrient fed and prevent infection with, things like, whole body antibiotics, systemic antibiotics, then you can support them long enough to survive. But above about 7 gray, you're not going to survive that. The highest radiation dose that's ever been reported and for somebody to survive is 8.5 sievert. 8.5 gray. So people have survived more than the lethal dose levels, but not a lot more, right? Okay. The next we're going to talk about are the long-term effects of radiation, okay? Long-term or latent. These effects can be anywhere from 3 months to decades after the incident that causes it happened, okay? The greatest percentage occur 10 to 15 years. This is primarily because of cataract. Cataract takes about 10 years to manifest, and that's one of the most common manifestations of long-term radiation exposure, right? Radiologists would often get cataract of the eye, which is why all radiologists now wear leaded glasses when they perform fluoroscopy and they do interventional radiography, because it doesn't manifest for 10 to 15 years for cataract of the eye, clouding of the lens of the eye. It's because the cells in the lens of the eye are long-lived, very long-lived, and it takes a long time for them to turn over and die and regenerate. Here's what's interesting about the long-term effects. Because they're associated with low dose levels, they're unpredictable. We cannot say, so Taylor, earlier you said, can you give me an example like a short-term thing? And I said, here's an example when this much radiation is received, right? Well, when the dose levels are low, there's no direct cause and effect, okay? Effects in the long term are unpredictable. We can't say this x-ray you get, this chest x-ray you get today is going to give you cancer in 30 years. We can say every time you get an x-ray done, that's increased exposure, and that will increase the likelihood for you to develop some condition in the long term. The terminology we use here, instead of unpredictable, we use the term stochastic. Okay, I'll spell it so everyone has it. Stochastic. So stochastic means random or unpredictable. Okay? So for an effect to be stochastic means that we can't say if it for sure will happen, but we can track like percentages of an incident percentage in a population, right? We can say that 6 to 7%, let's say 6% of all births have a congenital defect, okay? Extra toes, body born with the wrong parts on the wrong side, right? But a million different problems. Congenital defect. 6% of all births have that. We can say that with medical radiation exposure, which is 50% of all of your radiation per year, medical radiation, we can say that with that, the birth defect rate goes to about 7%. Okay, so about 1% increase, okay? But we can't say which children are going to be born with birth defects. We can say that in a population, the percentage of kids being born with birth defects goes up as the use of radiation goes up. Notice there's a cause and effect, but it's not direct to the person. We can only track this within a population and talk about it either does or doesn't occur, right? Severity of effects are unrelated to the dose. A very low dose can cause cancer, and a very, many low doses over time can also cause the same cancer, right? You're not going to get worse cancer because you got more x-rays. You just increase your likelihood to develop, the condition, cancer, whatever we're talking about. Yeah. Yeah. Can't read this. Cynthia. All right. Oh, just Cynthia and Brittany. Brittany here? There you are. You're sitting behind a couple people, that's why I couldn't see you. All right, so you guys, just financial aid before you leave today, okay? Please and thank you. All right. Yes, please.
So once you're exposed to radiation, you never shed it off, you never lose it?
No, because it
Just stays.
causes its damage right then, right when the exposure happens. So the damage is caused right when the exposure happens. It doesn't stick around and yes. So like, to X-ray exposure, right? It doesn't stick around. You exposed, the damage happens, and then you just move on, right? And some of the damage is repairable, some of it's cumulative, some of it, most of it doesn't manifest in the short term. Most of the effects will manifest in the long term, decades later.
So the X-ray going through doesn't stay in the body, it just continues moving on.
Yeah, but the trick
Or
is
does
the X-ray is not a thing; it's a wave.
No way.
It's just energy.
So the energy just continues.
It deposits into whatever it interacts with.
It hits the film.
Yeah, it hits the film, so it makes it all the way through your body and doesn't interact with anything, right? It's the film, or it is completely absorbed in your body, right? The energy from the X-ray is completely absorbed in your body, or it interacts with your body tissue, scatters, and those scatters absorb somewhere else, right? It's just, it transfers its kinetic energy to whatever it interacts with, yeah. But it doesn't stick around. Whatever it does it right when it interacts with it. Whatever damage happens right then.
Does it just keep going? When does it lose energy?
Well, so it spreads its energy out, right? So when I do that, right? I took my hand and I hit the table, right? What happened when I hit the table?
Wake up.
I woke everybody up, right? But what happened when I hit the table?
Yeah, the table shook, and then
So some of my my hand has mass, right?
Right.
And it had kinetic energy because I slammed it down, right? It gave my hand some velocity, right? So kinetic energy in my hand plus the mass, it has some energy to it, right? That energy.
Noise, the table shook, the noise dissipated, but it kind of rang out a little bit.
Yeah.
And then it died.
So it's kind of like asking what happened to the energy from my hand, right?
Exactly.
It's still somewhere, right? It just spread out, right? When I hit the table, it made the sound, it vibrated the table, it heated up the table just a little bit in the spot where I hit it, right? It shook my hand, remember equal and opposite reaction, right? Newton says there's equal and opposite reactions. So it shook my hand a little bit, right? Hurt my hand, right? It made sound that everyone heard, yeah? And those sound waves bounced off of everything in the room, vibrated everyone's eardrums, generated a little bit of electric signal in everybody's ears, right? That energy just spread out through space. Radiation does the same thing. It just spreads its energy out. That's all. Yeah.
Does it ever settle in a certain spot, or does it's always moving?
It spreads out. Yeah. It doesn't settle. Yeah. Yeah. It doesn't stay in one spot. Now that's X-rays. X-rays don't stay in one spot. They just spread their energy out through everything that they interact with. And so that's it. Just the energy is just deposited into everything, in anything that the X-ray beam interacts with. Particulate radiation is a little bit different, but similar concept. We're not going to talk about particulate radiation though, because it's just a harder thing to talk about. But yeah, so that's the deal though. Physics is this is why physics is fun for me, because I get to slam books down on the table and stuff and explain the conservation of energy. But just think about that. Energy is conserved, right? Whatever energy there was, it's still there. It's just spread out, right? Energy tends to spread out. Okay. So these long-term effects that we so the long-term effects are really the only ones that we worry about actually causing. We worry about causing these, okay? Medical radiation accounts for 51% of all the radiation that you receive in a year, okay? So something like 1 in 3, almost 30 to 50% of people, about 1 in 3 people gets an X-ray exam every year. But on the average, right, medical radiation for the average person spread across population, medical radiation accounts for over half of the amount of radiation you receive in a year, about 51% of all of your radiation. So take all the radiation you receive in a year, natural background, cosmic, terrestrial, right? Add on medical radiation's over half. Okay, so we have an effect. The X-ray techs who use the medical radiation have an effect on, patients' long-term radiation exposure, right? If we're always giving people more radiation than they otherwise needed, right, we're going to increase the likelihood that those people are going to develop bad problems in the future, right? Even though it doesn't cause them to, glow green right now, right, it can give them bad effects later on, okay? So some of these long-term effects can be things like cataract of the eye, carcinogenesis, otherwise known as cancer, lifespan shortening. This is an interesting one because there's no exact, here's why your lifespan is getting shorter. There's just an association with long-term radiation exposure and shorter lifespans. In the early days of X-ray, before we had the rules of radiation safety, radiologists were having shorter lifespans than the other doctors. So all radiologists were dying earlier than the other doctors, and eventually smart people looked around and went, why are all the radiologists dying before the other doctors? What are they doing differently, right? Oh, they're using this brand new thing we just created called X-rays. Maybe they're harmful, right? And then you get people getting to work to figure out why, right? The first death from radiation was recorded in 1904. Do you guys remember who it was? Not Röntgen, interestingly. Röntgen's wife died, though. Because, he's the one operating the equipment. She's the one being exposed to the equipment. It was not her, though. She wasn't the first death from radiation. You said it, Harvey. Daly, Clarence Daly. Who is Clarence Daly?
The guinea pig who basically was getting the first X-ray on his hand.
Who was using him as a guinea pig?
Thomas Edison.
Yeah, Edison, right? Everyone knows Thomas Edison, right? What did Thomas Edison do? Incandescent light bulb, right? To be clear, because I always like to make it clear, because Edison kind of makes himself sound better than he was. He didn't invent the incandescent light bulb. He made it better, right? He didn't invent AC electricity. Nikola Tesla invented AC electricity, and Edison took it, right? Good guy, but, got to give him the credit that he's actually due. Clarence Daly, Thomas Edison's assistant, died in 1904. Why Thomas Edison? Well, Edison here in the U.S. got word of Röntgen stuff that he did in 1895, and the year later, with 1896, Edison took Röntgen's ideas, built his own equipment, and built the first fluoroscope. Fluoroscopy is video X-ray, and Edison built the first one in 1896, the year after Röntgen discovered X-rays. By 1904, his assistant that he was guinea pigging, right, using as a guinea pig, dies from cancer. So, 1896 to 1904, 8 years later, right, his assistant dies from cancer. Right? Radiodermatitis, and guess where it was? It was his hands, and guess why? Because he kept making Daly put his hand on top of the X-ray machine so he could look in and look at the bones in his hand moving and do his little data gathering, right? He was a guinea pig. So yeah, he's credited as being the first death from radiation exposure. Now he had a short lifespan, but not the kind that I'm trying to hint at here. He had a short lifespan because he got cancer, okay? Lifespan shortening is a long-term effect, but it's not the kind where it's basically not cause death from cancer, right? It's just death because all of the cells of your body are effectively wearing out quicker, okay? With long-term chronic radiation exposure, the cells just have shorter lifespans and die sooner, and the lifespan of the organism shortens because of that. Leukemia is another possible long-term effect. We worry about leukemia in children, which is why we avoid, when possible, irradiating pregnant females, because childhood leukemia is already a problem, right? And this increases the possibility for childhood leukemia, radiation exposure to pregnant females. But leukemia in general, leukemia is a blood cell cancer, a form of blood cell cancer, and that's one possible long-term effect of radiation exposure. So yeah, physicians have to weigh the risks, right? They have to weigh the benefit from the radiographic procedure, has to outweigh the risks of the exposure. Average dose, annual dose, about 6.3 millisieverts from many sources, right? Radiation from Earth, called terrestrial radiation. Radiation from space, called cosmic radiation. And medical radiation. Medical radiation is more than half, at least 51%. CT scans account for a big chunk of that because CT scans use a ton of radiation. No doctors, no x-ray techs, no one else is in the room during a CT scan. It's the patient in the room, right? Because it uses a lot of radiation. Basically, a CT scanner is just an x-ray machine that moves around in a circle around the patient and takes thousands of pictures, thousands of images, where a plain film x-ray machine would take 1, 2, 3, 4, the CT scan takes many. That's why its exposure levels are so high.
The diagnostic,
I'm sorry?
the diagnostic scan.
Yeah, to be diagnostic. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so good. So there's our number. There's our an average natural background. If I left the Geiger counter on all year, it would count about half of this, because if you didn't take the Geiger counter into the X-ray room with you during But anyways, there's natural background. There's also medical radiation. Both of those count to your annual, yearly background dose. To put it into perspective, 6.3 millisieverts, like what does that even mean? The average X-ray tech, let me repeat that. Let me rephrase that. The yearly dose limit for radiographers is 50 millisieverts. Okay, so in rough terms, about 10 times this, right? You don't approach anywhere close to that as an X-ray tech. So your dose level is tracked. You're limited to 50 millisieverts per year. Nobody ever gets close to it. Okay, the amount of radiation we receive every year is so low. In fact, it's so low. So you have to wear a badge, right? But if you read the regulations for wearing radiation dosimetry badges, the verbiage says that if you must wear a radiation detection badge if it's reasonably anticipated that in your course of employment you will receive 10% of the natural background dose while at work, right? So take the natural background dose, 6.3 millisieverts, right? If you will receive 0.63 millisieverts in your job per year, then you must wear a radiation detection badge. You don't even get that. Okay, you don't even get that much as an X-ray tech. Okay, why? Because we have really good radiation safety practices, right? Our X-ray tubes are very specifically shielded. Our rooms are shielded, right? And we stand outside of the rooms at a control console behind a leaded glass window when we make exposures. If we're ever found in the X-ray room during an exposure, which never really happens, we're wearing leaded aprons. We're wearing gloves, we're wearing glasses, right? We're wearing thyroid shields, we're protecting ourselves, okay? And we're maintaining distance from the source of radiation. In fact, at the higher levels in radiography, when you work side by side with a radiologist, we're actually trained to use the radiologist as a shield. We're actually supposed to, and the radiologist knows this, they know what we're doing. We stand behind them. It's like, we do what we need to do, and then we just go hide behind the radiologist because we're using them as a shield, right? They have to be in front of the patient. I only have to be in front of the patient when I need to be in front of the patient, right? So I hide behind the radiologist. So we have all of these safety practices, and they mean that our X-ray exposures are so low that technically speaking, we're not radiation workers, which is kind of cool. Like, we work with radiation, right? But our radiation levels are so incredibly low that they're almost not even measurable, okay? In fact, most of the badge reports that you'll look at for yourself will say when it lists your exposure per quarter, it'll say M for minimal or N for negligible, right? So low that it's like undetectable. They don't even report a number for you, which is great, right? You don't want the extra exposure. Do you have a question?
For our badges here, do we get a report?
You do, yeah. We don't show you can see them. They're not a secret, but we don't just hand them out. You'd just go ask Geneva, and Geneva keeps a copy of everything, keeps it organized in your office. And that's also too small piece of advice and some on the subject. When you guys graduate, request a report, right? Because no one's going to keep track of your lifetime radiation accumulated dose. Okay, it's your job, right? As the employee. And your dose while in school is tracked, okay? So you should request the record of that when you graduate, okay? That way you can keep track of it, okay? We use one company for badges, and your employer might use another company, right? Those two companies are not going to communicate with each other, okay? It's going to be your job to make sure that you keep a good record. Small side note.
So you get new badges every year?
Quarterly. It's like every 3 months. It can be as often as every month, but they're most typically about 3-month quarterly badges. Yeah, and some people, some like radiation physicists, scientists who work with radiation all the time, they wear a badge that is measures dose and then is discharged every single day, and they just keep a log of their dose, and it's their job to keep track of it. So different types of occupations keep track of things differently, but typically radiographer badges are worn for 3 months. Yeah. All right. So we're gonna talk about safety, and then after we talk about safety, we're gonna take a small break, and then we're gonna try to discuss some of the actual chapter topics after this review. But patient safety is important. Okay, that's one of the main goals of radiation safety, the radiation safety modules. There's two real goals, right? How do you keep yourself safe? And then how do you keep everyone else safe, right? This is part of keeping everyone else safe, patient radiation safety. So if you remember nothing else, remember that you should keep the patient's dose as low as reasonably achievable, okay? We'll talk about the actual mechanisms that help do that, but that's the goal, keep the dose low. Unnecessary patient radiation dose primarily comes from repeated radiographs, okay? Why would a radiograph need to be repeated? A ton of different reasons, okay? But most commonly, they are either exposure or positioning errors, okay? So you are asked to put a patient into a position to demonstrate some anatomy, okay? You do your best, but you over-rotate or under-rotate or misalign something, right? There's roughly 14 different parameters that you have to think about with every exam you do. Every time you get in a room with a patient, you have to think there's a checklist of about 14 different things for every image you're going to make. And if you miss one of them, right, you're going to maybe need to repeat that x-ray, okay? If you miss the exact part position, or if you take your light field and you make it too small, right, or if your patient is slightly off center, right, any small technical change can cause a repeat in the image, and every time you have to repeat the image, that doubles the radiation dose, right? And the same if you have to repeat for exposure. If you underexpose or overexpose the patient, that may give you an image that is non-diagnostic, doesn't have the information needed to make a diagnosis, right? And you repeat it for that reason, okay? So you can reduce repeat radiographs by reduce patient exposure by a number of different ways. First off, confirm patient identity, right? That's step 0, right? You walk into the room, hi, my name is Alex, I'm an x-ray tech, I'm here to take your x-rays, and then you go, what's your name, right? And we confirm patient identity. We usually want to use 2 things, right? So what are 2 things we could use to confirm patient identity? Name and date of birth. So why don't we go with what street they live on and how tall they are?
Because you don't have that information.
Well, we do. We have their demographics, right? 'Cause we have access to their chart because we're part of their healthcare team, right? But it's not reliable information, right? That information might match someone else, right? They're less likely to match by name and date of birth, though, right? It's very, very rare that you're going to have 2 people with the same name and same date of birth, right? I said it's very rare, right? It can happen, yeah.
Maria Garcia, Juan Lopez.
Oh no, I'm not denying that there's a There's a bunch of, there's 800 million John Smiths out there in the world, right? But so you're gonna get people who match by name, right? But I would say it's very unlikely that you're gonna have two people match by name and match by date of birth, right? That's why you check multiple things. If you only checked name, then you'd be, getting 2 or 3 people standing up for the same name, right? You check last name too, and you get less people standing up. And if you check date of birth as well, you're gonna get only the right person standing up most of the time, right? I've had it where I tried to do this, and I had a Spanish-speaking elderly female who answered to the wrong name, right? And I said, the patient's name was Juan, okay? Juan Juan. I called Juan, and I was a student at the time. She stands up. I was like, "Are you sure?" And she said, "Yeah, you're Juan." Yep. Oh, all right, come on, let's go. So I get to the room, start to position for the exam, right? I'm a student, so didn't know anything yet. And it was the exam was for a foot x-ray. And she did not have a problem with her foot, right? So I'm positioning for her foot x-ray, and she's giving me this weird look, right? And finally, I didn't speak great Spanish. I still don't speak great Spanish, but at the time I was learning. And I finally got out of her like what she was there for, and it was like her hand or something like that. And I asked her what her name was, So instead of me saying her name and her saying, "Yeah, that's my name," I was like, "What's your name?" And she told me it was Maria. It was a completely different name, right? And so I learned from that you have to verify the patient by multiple things, right? Name and date of birth, because a patient might respond incorrectly to the name, right? They might respond incorrectly to the date of birth, but if you use both of those, they're much less likely to respond incorrectly. And double check it, right? Double check it when you get to the x-ray room.
In this area, it happens a lot. I noticed it more with people from Oaxaca because it's just a little bit more difficult. There's more of a language barrier between, I'm not from Oaxaca. My family's from Jalisco, Michoacan, and our Spanish is very.
So the dialects change.
Very different. So the comprehension.
So even speaking Spanish, there's some barrier. I mean that's obvious because speaking English, there's a billion different dialects in English, right? And we're gonna have difficulty communicating, right? Absolutely.
In that example, it's actually almost a weekly thing that you have someone stand up for that's the wrong patient.
Yeah.
And they don't really understand all that well.
Sure.
But they will stand up just thinking it's their turn. And it happens with everybody.
Yeah.
But it happens a lot more in this area because there's a lot of people from Oaxaca.
Yeah.
So that Maria, all that stuff, you really have to check it. I've had two different Marias, same last name, Garcia, whatever the example was, same date of birth, same day, and we're lucky that we have like a picture in the EHR
Yes,
that shows
that's
the
important.
difference, but it's actually, it happens very frequently.
Definitely. And so you can minimize that. I mean, it's going to happen, right? So you can minimize it by asking those extra things, right? And so that's going to, and so, confirm the exam that they're there for, right? And once you do all of that, you should by that point have the right patient, right? The worst thing you could do though is what I almost did as a student, right? Don't worry about that. What I almost did as a student was, bring the patient to the x-ray room, and I almost got to the point of taking the exam, right? So, and that happens, you get the wrong patient, right? You get to the point of positioning, as long as you don't take the x-ray, no real problems happen, right? So you can fix that. The other problem that happens is you got the right patient, but you did the wrong exam. Okay, that happens frequently too, especially with students who are learning, right? They might even get the right exam, but they might do the positioning completely wrong, right? I have a lot, and students who are taking x-rays right now, tell me if this rings a bell. Does anybody have problems when doctors order a foot or an ankle, confusing those two types of radiographs? Anybody had that issue yet? Yeah. So tell me what the...
So it's for the oblique.
Yeah.
So instead of having it, flat on the surface, I have it like this, and I do an ankle.
So like you want a foot, but you end up positioning for an ankle. Yeah. Yep. That's super duper common for students. Like you're unique, but you're not unique in that regard, right? That happens all the time, right? So learning the exams that are requested, what images are required per exam, that's going to help reduce that rate of errors. You know, if you have a chance to talk with a physician, talking with a physician helps too. Keeping your eyes open when you're in the X-ray room and, you know, looking at the body part that we're X-raying, right? Using your brain, right? So all these things are going to help, right? Reduce the number of repeats. Confirm identity, do the right exam. That's important. It just says reduce the number of repeat X-rays. That's great. We'd love to do that. So there's many things we can do to make that happen. Again, one of the main causes of repeat X-rays is our positioning errors. Okay. After we finish physics, I believe we're getting into what I call the categories, which are going to start to talk about some of the body parts and how we actually position for them. Okay. And we'll have positioning days and things like that. So we're going to get some time on that, and you get plenty of it when you're out at your in the medical setting. So positioning is huge. Use the smallest radiation field possible. Okay. Underneath every X-ray machine. So this thing here is an old X-ray tube. This would sit on a stand in the room, and underneath that would be one of these boxes. Okay. This is a small one, but underneath that would be one of these boxes. The X-ray beam would come right through here from that big cylinder that sits above that, and the X-ray beam comes out the bottom. What this box lets you do, though, well, I'll pass this around in a moment, especially to the new people. This box has some knobs on it, right? And inside of here are lead strips. One set of lead strips going this way, another set going this way, okay? And what the lead strips can do is they can change the size of your radiation field, and you can affect how much radiation you're letting out, meaning you can affect how much of the body you are actually irradiating, okay? You can make your radiation field small or large. Now there's some, I'll pass this around. You guys look up in here as you kind of move the knobbies around. But there are rules that we try to follow, right? There are regulations that say your radiation field, the light field that's projected down, can never be larger than the image receptor that you're using, okay? Your radiation field needs to be only large enough to demonstrate the anatomy that should be demonstrated for that exam, okay? For example, a hand X-ray, I don't have any X-rays out. For a hand X-ray, you only need to demonstrate 1 to 2 inches of the radius and ulna of the arm. You X-ray the entire hand, but only 1 to 2 inches of the radius and ulna, the long bones of the arm. If you get a bunch of radius and ulna here, right, a long light field, you're not doing the right job. You're X-raying more of the body than you should have, right? So using the smallest radiation field possible. This next concept I'm going to talk about more in a little bit, but it's to use the highest kVp for the body part. kVp stands for kilovoltage peak, and it's a number that we set that sets the X-ray beam's energy. Okay? You can make the X-ray beam more or less penetrating by changing this number. If you haven't had that in your hand before, you should take a look at it, the collimator box. Good, okay. So I'm going to talk about kVp later. It's what, remember earlier I said there's a thing called a technical factors, or technique, right? A radiographic technique. This is part of it. I'll talk more about it in a little bit. Using a source to image distance with a minimum of 40 inches. SID stands for source to image distance. Radiation spreads out as it moves through space, okay? You know, I could give you the example with a flashlight. I can shine a flashlight at you right in your eyes, and you go, ow, that hurts, right? And then I back the flashlight up, you know, let's say I'm 1 foot away from you. I go to 2 feet away from you, right? Shine the flashlight in your eyes again, you go, ow, that hurts, but less, right? I go to 3 feet away from you, shine the flashlight in your eyes, you're like, it's not so bad anymore. Back up again, shine the flashlight in your eyes again, and it's less and less painful each time I back up and shine the flashlight in your eyes, right? Why is that the case? I'm further away. What's happening as I go further away?
The lights is
spreading out, right?
spreading out.
The intensity of radiation decreases as you increase your distance from the source. There's a law called the inverse square law for radiation that we're going to learn about, not today, that says that, but in like rigorous quantitative terms, it says exactly how much the intensity changes as you change your distance, okay? The converse of that is as you shorten the distance, the intensity increases, okay? So we have a minimum distance that we keep the X-ray machine, X-ray tube, away from the patient, okay? The National Council for Radiation Protection, the NCRP, says there should be a minimum distance of no less than 12 inches from source to skin, okay? That means from the source of radiation inside that big cylinder up there to the surface of the skin can be no less than 12 inches. We almost always keep it at 40 inches or more. Okay. In fact, there's really no time when you're going to have an SID of less than 40 inches. Okay. So we maintain a distance. The further away you are, the lower the intensity is. Lastly, the greatest cause of unnecessary radiation to patients that can be controlled by us is repeat exposures. That's the biggest cause of increased patient exposure. How do we fix this? Well, there are quality assurance procedures such as the quarterly repeat review, the quarterly repeat or retake analysis, okay? The X-ray supervisor operator, the doctor who's in charge of your office's X-ray equipment, quarterly goes and looks at all of your repeated images and goes, what's going on here, right? Are there too many? Is there just the right amount, right? And looks at the repeated images and tries to figure out why are we repeating these images, okay? So let me say it like this. You will repeat X-rays. It's just going to happen, okay? You want to repeat as few as you can, but you're always going to repeat some, okay? A good X-ray tech repeats no more than about 5% of their images. You want to shoot for between 3 and 5%. The lower you are, the better. But a good X-ray tech repeats no more than 5%. So 5 out of 100. Okay. You may take anywhere from several hundred to potentially several thousand if you're the only X-ray tech in a quarter. Okay. My office takes about 3,000 images per quarter, and we repeat no more than, our repeat percentage is like 1 or 2%. Right. No more than 1 or 2 or 400 of those, roughly, right, ish, right, and spread out across all the X-ray techs, okay, and that's the idea. You want to keep your repeat percentages low. Someone keeps track of it. There's no way to hide your repeat X-rays. They just are there, right, and so we review them, right. There'd be no good reason to hide it. You want to know if you're doing good, right, know if you can improve or not, right, and I'll tell you the most commonly repeated exam, a chest X-ray, just a regular front view chest X-ray. Why? Because our cassettes are only a certain size and lungs can be very big, okay? And it's hard to fit lungs in that field, right? So most commonly repeated exam across the board, chest X-rays, specifically the front view of the chest. And it's just, it's how it's always been. Okay, actually, let me, yeah. Let's go ahead and take a break. Let's take like a 10-minute break here. Let you guys stretch.